Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, in the eyes of many, the epitomal tale of tragedy. In the eyes of all, a respected, and if not revered, tale of Gothic artistic brilliance. But what is it about this story? A story that's so filled with page upon page of misery and woe. A story so deeply poetic and metaphorical that its contents have enraptured the world for multiple centuries. The obsession, the lethal curiosity of Dr. Frankenstein? Is it the inhuman, yet strikingly familiar struggle of Frankenstein's monstrous creation? Or is it merely the image of the monster itself that has held so firm a grip on all that have beheld it? In time, we'll find out. But for now, I'll take you to a time of endless cold, and a time of unrelenting rain, a time of winter and the summer. I'd take you to Lord Byron's estate in Lake Geneva. Let's go. (1816), the year without a summer. The days were short, the nights were long. Unbeknownst to most of the world, Mount Tambora in Indonesia had erupted in the preceding year, bringing a great cloud of doom and darkness over the majority of the Western world. During this time, candles were lit at midday. Many Americans were forced to move west. The Irish endured nearly 2 months of an unrelenting torrential downpour. The gloom of the grayest skies, the frigid rain, the unrelenting flashes of white lightning. A night like that is perfect for a bit of storytelling. Never was a scene more awfully desperate. The trees in these regions are incredibly large and stand in scattered clumps all over the white wilderness. The vast expanse of snow was checkered only by these gigantic pines and the poles that marked our road. These are the words of Mary Shelley herself, describing her account of the bleak and desolate roads which would lead her to Lord Byron's estate. And, however peculiar it may seem, these were the very same bleak and desolate roads that would lead Mary to fulfill her destiny. Her destiny as the writer of the most renowned romantic horror novel of all time. Now, before we can come to understand the master work that Mary Shelley would conceive of when she reached the Villa Diodati, or Lord Byron's rented estate, we must understand Mary Shelley herself, and we must understand the circumstances which led to her being in the middle of one of the most iconic moments in literary history. Mary Shelley, born Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, led a life haunted by tragedy from the beginning. 11 days after her birth, on August 30th, 1797, Mary's mother died from a complicated placental infection. As a teenager, Mary left England for Scotland on a temporary retreat so that she might escape her stepmother, whom she held great disdain for. Upon Mary's return to England, a couple of years later, she found herself reuniting with poet and great admirer of her father's, Percy Shelley. Percy and Mary would come to develop an intimate personal relationship, despite Percy having already been betrothed to another. The two eventually fled England together, angering Mary's father and leaving Percy's wife to the cold embrace of despair, an embrace from which she would find no warmth or solace until her eventual suicide 2 years later. Upon their return to England, a short 2 months after, Mary and Percy found that their youthful carelessness had had devastating effects. They found themselves penniless, excommunicated, and, for the most part, utterly alone. The young and reckless lovers stuck by one another's side, however, in the next 2 years would see the couple push onward regardless. Those years would bring about change for Mary and Percy, but on both sides of that mischievous coin. Percy had achieved financial stability for himself and for Mary. The two had managed to once again establish themselves within the warming arms of friends, something that their controversial reputations had deprived them of previously. Yet, the cloud of misery over Mary's existence once again proved itself to be inescapable. Mary and Percy had successfully conceived a little girl named Clara, only for baby Clara to leave our world behind days later. The unimaginable horror of losing a child would haunt Mary for the rest of her days, the ghost of her child rattling chains and slamming shut open doors within the dark halls of her mother's tortured mind for the remainder of Mary Shelley's existence. Which brings us back to the frigid waters of Lake Geneva. A symphony of howling winter winds, the dark beauty of a cold, nearly inhospitable Switzerland, the boredom of a few brilliant minds, and the sudden genius of one. All of these are undoubtedly a collective of contributions to the idea that would come to Mary Shelley on that fateful night. One thing, however, is certain. In tandem with Mary's dreadful experiences with childbirth, with the creation of life, each of these elements had brought to Mary a vision in the night. In her own words, her nightmare transpired in this way. When I placed my head upon my pillow, I did not sleep, nor could I be said to think. I saw, with shut eyes but acute mental vision, I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then, on the working of some powerful engine, show signs of life, and stir with an uneasy, half-vital motion. Frightful must it be, for supremely frightful would be the effect of any human endeavor to mock the stupendous creator of the world. This disturbingly curious, thought-provoking vision came to Mary following a request made by her host, Lord Byron, to conceive of the most terrifying ghost story imaginable. In fact, Mary Shelley hadn't been the only one given such a task. Mary and her soon-to-be husband, Percy, were with curious company. Mary and Percy were joined, of course, by their host, the Lord Byron himself, the enigmatic and charismatic poet of legend, whose strange deeds and thoughtful works would, much like those in his company, far outlive his mortal existence. There also dwelled John Polidori, an English writer and Lord Byron's traveling physician, who would, upon taking inspiration from Byron's own work during this time, pen the short story The Vampire, which would come to inspire another classic literary work, which is a tale best told in the future. Among Percy, Mary, Byron, and John was yet another. Claire, Mary's stepsister, had been pregnant with Byron's child due to a past intimate encounter with him, thus explaining the presence of Mary and Percy, as Claire had invited her stepsister and Percy as companions of a sort, in an attempt to force Byron to claim responsibility over the new life, a request to which Lord Byron callously accepted under the conditions that Claire must abstain from any contact with him or the child after its birth. While all involved in the house were friendly enough, to cast the entire group under the shadow of friends would be a false notion. The stress of a world that seemed to be crumbling around the group mixed well with the paranoia and lust that seemed to linger in the air, striking rarely but ever present. The days and nights at Villa Diodati were spent either in deep conversations of philosophy or by the telling of ghost stories. This passing of the time led Byron to propose his contest. It was after this request that the chilling vision of an overambitious pupil and that pupil's grotesque creation came to Mary. 2 years after Mary Shelley left the Villa Diodati to fade into memory, Frankenstein lived. So, what exactly is the story of Frankenstein and his monstrous creation? Well, for those of you out there that haven't read it before, I'm sure you already assume that it's not entirely what Hollywood has made it out to be. You would be correct in that assumption. But these are topics that we'll explore more in the future. For now, we're going to step into Mary Shelley's own nightmare for a brief moment. Clearly, doing a synopsis or a summary of a story is not going to do the entire thing justice. I can't simply break down every single point, every single theme in this story. In fact, I could probably sit down and do an entire video just on the themes that could be found in Frankenstein. Instead, I'll just point out a few that I think are the most relevant and the most poignant that can be found in this absolute nightmare that Mary Shelley brought us. I think it's fair to say that Frankenstein, in essence, is less of a cautionary tale and more of a simple commentary. I don't think that Mary Shelley sought to warn us of anything in particular. I think she was simply reminding us, giving us a commentary that through our incessant drive to go further and to innovate and to create, that we can destroy ourselves and that we will. The point in the story where Frankenstein urges Walton to go on, despite the obvious and horrible consequences that he himself is damned in his own pursuit. That point is interesting, and that's what makes me think that this is less of a cautionary tale, because Mary Shelley wasn't one to really try and do things like that. Mary's even said herself, and I quote, "I am not a person of opinions because I feel the counter arguments too strongly." So this leads me to believe that while writing Frankenstein, Mary probably had little else in mind than bringing a story to the world. I'm not sure she had an agenda, really. And this book also raises the question of what makes something human. Is it purely scientific or physical, or is it something more emotional and spiritual? Is Frankenstein's monster really less than human? In my opinion, the ability to feel, the ability to empathize, the ability to sympathize, these are things that make people human, which is why Frankenstein's monster's fits of rage and despair are less confusing to me and more understandable. Things that kind of make sense. And I think that was Mary Shelley's point in creating this internal conflict with Frankenstein's monster. At least, I hope so, because that's what I got from it. But that's the point of the story, isn't it? That's what's truly horrific here. The terrifying thing about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, her magnum opus, is humanity itself. Victor Frankenstein, the doctor, was never evil. Was he selfish? Absolutely. Was he curious? Without a doubt. Was he evil? Not inherently. You know what all of those traits do make Victor, though? They make him human. It's an attractive idea to say that Victor Frankenstein is just this evil, selfish doctor looking only to defy God and looking only to satisfy his own selfish needs. That's an idea that Hollywood has certainly run with before. But to outright see Victor Frankenstein as the true monster of this story is to kind of undermine the entire point. There are a lot of portions in this book that, in vivid, heart-wrenching detail, discuss feelings like despair and depression and paranoia, particularly on Victor himself, as well as the monster. It's kind of an even split between the two, how in-depth Mary Shelley chooses to go with the ways in which they are feeling. And the way in which that she chooses to do this is extremely powerful and extremely potent. And if you've ever felt any of these feelings before, you will feel them again while reading this book, because the way in which these things are described are extremely real, extremely raw. While the elements of the story might be fantastical in nature, the feelings certainly aren't. The feelings are very grounded in reality, perhaps more so than any other book I've ever read. People can be shockingly cruel and intolerant, but people can also feel extremely miserable. The world is a confusing and unforgiving place, and Frankenstein, the book, does not shy away from that fact. Frankenstein ends sadly, in images such as the monster holding on to the blind man's feet, just begging for him and for the family to give him a chance, or of Victor lamenting over his mistakes and his regret in the mountains of Switzerland, or of Victor finding his new bride, who he's been in love with and known since he was a child, murdered in his bed by his own creature. These images haunt you. They do, and they stick with you. And that's the other thing about Frankenstein. The images, these living, breathing paintings, are kind of what have kept Frankenstein alive to this day. There have been countless spin-offs and interpretations of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, but there's one interpretation that still holds complete dominion over the rest. And currently, it even kind of holds dominion over Mary Shelley's own story. By far the most recognizable and the most striking image of Frankenstein stems from Boris Karloff's portrayal in the 1931 film of the same name. The makeup of the monster was the work of a man named Jack Pierce, who, in tandem with Karloff and director James Whale, created the look of Frankenstein's monster that we all recognize immediately to this day. In the book, the creature had long black hair, wore a simple coat, and did not have bolts coming out of his head. Or at least if he did, Mary Shelley never told us that. In fact, in the book, there's no insinuation that electricity was involved in the creation of the monster at all. But it didn't matter. The movie took a lot of creative liberty with Shelley's story, liberties that would come to define the monster as most know him. But that was alright. There may be no Igor in the book, as there would commonly be in subsequent adaptations of Frankenstein stories. There may not have been that striking image of a burning windmill that we've all come to recognize. The monster might have been a fast-moving, complex, intelligent being in the book, and a bumbling fool in the iconic film. And the deeper meanings and complexities of the book might have been lost in translation somewhere down the line. But you know what? It's okay. Because the film did capture something very important. Something that has given the monster the justice in our world that it didn't get in his own. It gave him the platform to be accepted, to be revered, to be loved. The perfect storm of Karloff's emotional weight, as well as director James Whale's creative vision and Jack Pierce's iconic design, really boiled down the horror of being human and projected onto Frankenstein's monster the most horrific element of being human that there is, the horror of being misunderstood. In the film, the monster is hated immediately upon his creation, and he is misunderstood and hated everywhere he goes. He eventually befriends a little girl only to kill her on accident, and the torches of the townspeople ensure that he burns for his mistakes. The image of Frankenstein's monster has been immortalized, but maybe all behind all the makeup and the bolts and the strange shaped head is something that we all fear, something that saddens us even to think about. We all fear the unknown. So, what greater horror is there than being the unknown? That's a nightmare some of us running around out here live. There are a lot of Frankenstein's monsters out there among us. Let's try to be a little bit nicer to him.